Greetings, business management students, BEC111. This is now chapter 3, where we are focusing on establishing a business. So we are saying once you have decided to become an entrepreneur, the next step would then be to establish your own business or to establish the business. So in this chapter, these are the learning outcomes that we ought to be able to do, and they include that by the end of the chapter you ought to be in a position to understand and discuss key considerations that are applicable when a form of business is to be chosen. Before you choose to operate or to start as a sole proprietorship or as a partnership or as a business trust, as a close corporation or as a company, what are key considerations? What are the key factors that you consider that will lead you to choose one form of business enterprise over the other? You also ought to be in a position to distinguish between the different forms of business enterprises that we find in South Africa. These obviously include your sole proprietorship, partnership, close corporation, business trusts, companies, be it public or private. You should also be in a position to explain the objectives, importance, and the need for a business plan. You should be in a position to evaluate a business plan to actually determine whether it works or it doesn't, whether what is in the business plan can work or it's something that has just been put on the paper to convince people that it will work. You should also be in a position to give an overview of a business plan, to know the main elements, main components of a business plan. You should also be in a position to identify the factors that are considered by entrepreneurs when they are choosing the location of their businesses. So this is basically it for chapter 3, and we will follow this particular outline. We will look at the introduction first, then the legal forms of ownership, developing a business plan for the new business. Then we also discuss the location of a business. So starting with the legal form of ownership, it's important to realize that there are various forms of enterprises that an entrepreneur can choose from when they want to conduct their business. The first fundamental issue an entrepreneur is faced with is to choose the type of enterprise. So whilst there are a number of forms of enterprises that one can choose from, it is important to realize that there are various advantages of those and also disadvantages of those. So important decisions have to be made by the entrepreneur to decide which form of business enterprise they will opt for. So understanding the features of each enterprise and how it will influence the entrepreneur's circumstances is the key to choosing the right form of ownership. So at this stage, we cannot say this particular form of ownership is better than the other. It's a matter of circumstances of the entrepreneur, which works best, considering the circumstances that the entrepreneur may find himself or herself in. So key considerations that entrepreneurs should consider when they are choosing the form of business enterprise, they include these ones which we are discussing on this particular slide. One being legal or juristic personality. So there are certain forms of business enterprise that have legal personality. In short, we are saying these are regarded as juristic persons or as legal persons. They are actually regarded as separate legal persons by law. So an example that I may give maybe is that if we were to look at forms of business enterprises that do not have separate legal personality, those will be your sole proprietorship, your partnerships. They are not regarded by law as separate legal persons. But companies they are actually regarded as separate legal persons. So one can actually choose whether they want to operate a business that is considered by law as a separate legal person. There are advantages for that. There are also disadvantages, maybe, but it's a decision that entrepreneurs need to make. Then another key consideration, or another factor that also ought to be considered, is the issue of continuity or perpetual existence. There are some forms of business enterprises that once the entrepreneur falls sick, or they are incapacitated, or they die, the business dies with them. A perfect example of a business without continuity or perpetual existence is a sole proprietorship or sole traders. Once the owner dies, normally they die with their businesses. But that is not the case with other forms of business, with other forms of businesses such as companies. It's also important to realize that in cases of partnerships, they also don't have continuity or perpetual existence. Those that understand would actually realize that once one partner decides to move out of the contract or out of the partnership, you need to draw a new partnership deed. So that means that will be a new business altogether. That will be a new partnership altogether. We also look at limited liability as a factor when choosing the form of business enterprise. In terms of limited liability, you need to understand that there are businesses or forms of businesses that have limited liability. In this case, we are saying the liabilities of the business, they do not extend to a point where the creditors can even attach the assets of the owners or of the shareholders. But once a business is owing or it has its creditors, the creditors have no right whatsoever to attach assets of the owners, be it during liquidation or when the business becomes insolvent, when it cannot pay its creditors. The creditors will not have a right to attach or to liquidate the assets of individual owners. That is to say, if the business has limited liability. But there are other forms of business enterprises that have unlimited liability. So what it means if your business has unlimited liability is that if your business is owing someone and the business is failing to pay, they can actually take or attach your assets, your own personal assets, wherever they may be. They can attach them and recover whatever your business is owing them. So we need to understand the difference between limited liability and unlimited liability, so that when we are making the choice of business form, we actually make that choice with information. Also, there's the issue of degree of control or degree of management authority. Some people, when they establish businesses, they want total control, where no one else tells them what to do. They do everything according to their will. Whatever they want becomes the law. So that is the case with sole proprietorships, because there is only one owner. He makes all the decisions. He doesn't fight with anyone. Whatever he wants to do in the business is what goes. But in terms of the degree of control and management authority, when it becomes a partnership, you will realize that there are more than two, or there are two or more people. So the level of control that one person may have may actually decrease. In terms of companies also, it's not like one person has total control unless they are the majority shareholders. So the issue of control will also need to be considered. Then the potential for capital acquisition. Potential for capital acquisition. So when we speak of potential for capital acquisition, we're speaking of how easy is it for that form of business to raise capital. just think of a sole proprietorship whereby there is only one person. If that person has connections, if that person has everything that is needed by the banks to grant them credit, maybe they may access funds. But if that person lacks what it takes for them to access funds from banks, they may not access it. But once you bring in other people, maybe in the form of a partnership, it may become a bit easier to access funds. If it's a company, maybe there may be a number of shareholders with assets, then it may become much easier to access finances. Then there is also the issue of compliance with legal formalities and regulations. How easy is it to comply? So the regulations that are put in for companies are obviously different from those that are put in for sole proprietorships or for partnerships. So it's another factor that is also considered. Then also the issue of tax. How do you want your business to be taxed? Do you want it to be taxed separately from the owners, or you want it to be taxed as part of the income of the owners? So obviously for companies, they are taxed separately. Sole proprietorship, since they are not regarded as separate legal persons, the profits for the business is obviously taxed as the income for the owner. Then also you should also look at the transferability of interests. How easy is it to transfer interests from one person to another? In a partnership, quite difficult, because once you bring in a new member, you need to draw up a new partnership deed. In a sole proprietorship, once you bring another person, it ceases to be a sole proprietorship. It becomes another form of business. In terms of a company, we have public companies and private limited companies. If it's a private limited company, you can't just sell your shares at the stock exchange. So transferability of interest may be limited. But if it's a public limited company, transferring interests will be actually much easier. So these are some of the factors that as potential entrepreneurs or as business management students, we need to know before we can decide on which form of business enterprise is better in these particular circumstances. So looking at a sole proprietorship, this is basically a business that is owned, controlled, and managed by one individual. Advantages of such is that it is easy to create. Once you decide, you go for it, you are running a business. It's the least way to start a business. The owner has total decision-making authority. There are no special legal restrictions, and it is easy to discontinue. So once you die, the business dies with you. Once you decide to stop operating, that's it. You just stop operating. The disadvantages associated with this form of business is that the owner is personally liable. So for whatever the business may be owing other people, the owner is personally liable. There is also limited diversity in terms of skills and capabilities. This is mainly because there is only one person who's owning the business and who's also managing the business. The owner has limited access to capital, so if you do not have anything that it takes for you to access capital, the business may not access capital. There is lack of continuity. As I said, it's easy to discontinue. So the fact that it's easy to discontinue, there is also lack of continuity. If the owner dies, the business dies with them. So while it is very easy to start as a sole proprietor, if you're thinking of perpetual existence of the business and you want to build a legacy, it's always good to consider other forms of business enterprises. Then moving on to partnership. A partnership is basically a contractual relationship between two or more persons who operate a lawful business with the objective of making a profit. There are advantages and disadvantages of this form of business enterprise. It's important to realize that in terms of disadvantages, they are more or less the same with those of sole proprietorship. The owners or the partners are personally liable. It's actually a relative difficulty in disposing of an interest in the partnership. Because once you want to transfer your interests, it means you are closing that particular partnership and a new agreement have to be formed. There is also potential for conflict between partners, because now it's not like a case where there's only one person and whatever they say goes. In this case, there are two people. And two or more people. And in most cases, wherever you have two or more people, you are bound to have people not agreeing on everything. Because people see things differently. Even in terms of calculating risks, they calculate risks differently. This form of business also lacks continuity. If one partner dies, then it means a new partnership has to be formed. You close that particular one and you start another one. In terms of advantages, it's also easy to form. Since there are many people, there are more people. Unlike in the case of a sole proprietorship, there's diversity of skills and abilities of the partners. Now, legal and natural persons may be partners. So you can have a case whereby a natural person is actually in a partnership with a company. There is also increased opportunity for accumulation of capital. This form of business enterprise requires minimal legal formalities and regulations. It's not difficult to form. Then there is also a close corporations. These ones you can no longer register new close corporations in South Africa, but may have one or more members, but it's closed at 10. So you cannot have more than 10 members that can own and control the close corporation. It exists as a separate legal person. So advantages, obviously, people are registering close corporations because of that separate legal personality. There's also limited liability of the members. Members are not personally liable. There is increased capital acquisition potential. Management is relatively simple because the requirements that are there and regulations that are there are not as strict as those of companies. There is also perpetual existence. But however, in terms of disadvantages, membership is limited at 10. You cannot have a close corporation with more than 10 members. Juristic persons may not be members. Companies cannot be members of a close corporation. In South Africa, you can no longer register new close corporations, so you can register your business now as a partnership if you were considering to register it as a close corporation, or you can register it as a company. It could be subjected to strict accountability under the new companies regulations of 2011. Then in terms of the company, a company is developed to obtain more capital than they could through sole proprietorship, partnership, and ownership and control is separated. So it's a form of business enterprise where ownership is separated from control. People who actually own the business are separated from those that run it or those that control it. So it's controlled and run by directors, but it is owned by the shareholders. There are a number of profit companies. We have public companies, private companies, state-owned companies, personal liability companies. Then we also have non-profit companies. I was shocked to learn that some churches actually register as non-profit companies. Some charity organizations also register as non-profit companies. In terms for companies, for purposes of this course, it is also necessary and important to realize that there are differences between public companies and private companies. So as you read your textbook, it is important to note the differences in terms of the number of members that is required and allowed for each of those. And also the differences in terms of the number of director requirements. The number of directors that is required for private companies is different from that which is required for public companies. There is also the issue of transferability of shares, because it is easier to transfer shares in a public company than in a private limited company. This also in terms of shares, the general public do not find it easy or cannot find it easy to buy shares of a private company. In case of a private limited company, it's usually identified by Pty Ltd. But if it's a public company, it's only limited. There is no private. Private company is not strictly controlled as public company in terms of legal regulations. Public companies are actually required to publish their financial statements. That is not the case with private companies. These are the advantages. The main disadvantages, they really relate to operational costs, which are said to be high, and also the degree of legal regulation, which is also seen as high. But there are advantages, because there is no restriction on the number of shareholders. So you can have as many owners as possible. Unfortunately, that also has an effect in terms of control. Because once there are many shareholders, if you are not the main shareholder, it means you also don't have much control in that company. There is limited liability. The owners will not be held personally liable for the debts of the company. A company can raise large amounts of capital. There is separate ownership and control, and continuity and transferability of shares is possible. Legal persons, natural persons, they can actually become members. Then we also have what are known as business trusts. These are established out of an ordinary trust, and the objective of they also have an objective of conducting business for profit. It is not a juristic person, but it can be regarded as a separate person in terms of for tax purposes. Income tax on income according to the conduit principle. So you need to read a bit of commercial law to understand the conduit principle. Transfer of interest of a beneficiary is done by a variation of the trust deed. Because once a trust is registered, there are trustees, then there are also beneficiaries. So if you want to transfer interest, you will have to revise the trust deed so that you vary the interest of each beneficiary. Forming a trust is easy. Natural and legal persons can actually become parties to a trust. There is limited liability, extreme flexibility, and there is also absence of legal regulations. It is possible to have perpetual existence. However, there is limited access to control and potential for conflict between parties. Then we also have cooperative societies. Cooperative society, basically this is an autonomous association of persons who unite voluntarily. It's voluntary to meet the needs by means of a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. It's important to know that whilst there are many advantages and many disadvantages, in cooperatives, decisions are actually made democratically. People vote. And they say people have equal votes. So it's unlike a case of companies where the majority shareholder may have more influence than others. In the case of cooperatives, it's one man, one vote. So I think in terms of various forms of business enterprises, you can actually now decide if you were considering, or if you were thinking which one may be the best. You can actually assess and evaluate, looking at the advantages and disadvantages of each of these. So we'll move on to business plans, developing a business plan for a new business. A business plan is a written document that can be used by an entrepreneur. Most people think that a business plan is only used for funding, simply because that's when most people think of a business plan. But there are various objectives of a business plan. The most important objective is actually to identify and describe the nature of the new business opportunity or venture. The second objective is to present a written plan on how the entrepreneur plans to exploit that opportunity. And the third objective of the business plan is to attract investors, to persuade a bank or other institution or person who provides financial resources to lend the entrepreneur the money that they need to establish the business. So some people actually think that no, you can operate without a business plan. And studies have actually shown that there are a lot of people, a lot of business people, a lot of entrepreneurs, if you would say so, or a lot of small business owners who operate without business plans. If you ask them for a business plan, they don't have it. They never used it. So these are some of the benefits of actually writing up a business plan. These are some of the benefits. You actually know where you are going. People who actually know, even if they are coming in as your managers, they know where you want to take the business to. They know the actual objectives of the business. They will also understand the vision that you have with the business. A business plan can also be seen as a tool for attracting money. Before anyone actually offers or invests in your business, they will want to see your business plan. They will not just put in their money without understanding to what extent is your business likely to succeed. So the importance and necessity of a business plan, reasons why people ought to draft or to write business plans. One of the reasons is that if you want to sell the business, before you even sell it to other people, you can actually draft a business plan to sell the business to yourself, to convince yourself that it works. Put it in writing, put the vision in writing, so that you will be able even yourself to run with it. If you also write up a business plan, whoever you want to sell the business to, they will be able to read and understand it. A business plan is also prepared for people or for entrepreneurs to obtain bank finances. So whenever you apply for a bank loan, the bank will obviously request you to also submit a business plan. A business plan is also written or prepared to obtain investment funds from other investors, not necessarily from banks. If you want to arrange for strategic alliances, to have long-term suppliers, long-term customers, those may actually also request to see your business plan. So it is necessary when you want to arrange strategic alliances. When you also want to obtain large contracts, sometimes you will be requested to submit a business plan. A business plan is also requested or required when you want to attract key employees. Before they join you, they want to see where you are going. Where are you planning to go? How are you planning to get there? before they risk losing the income that they may be receiving, before they make up their mind to join you, they need to know if whatever you are proposing to them will actually work. So it's important in attracting key employees with key competencies, employees with key skills, not those that are desperate. A business plan is also needed when you want to complete mergers and acquisitions. You will also need a business plan. It can also be used to motivate and focus management team. If you as an entrepreneur put everything in writing and you give those that are working under you as your managers, they will be able to actually go with the business where you want them to go with it. But if you leave it for them to guess, they may take your business wherever they are able to, and you cannot blame them. So there are stakeholders in a business plan. These are parties that are interested in knowing the contents of a business plan. So there are those within the organization, for example, your management team and your employees. Then there are also external stakeholders, like your customers, your investors, and your banks. Those are external stakeholders. Although they are outside your organization, they are interested in knowing the contents of your business plan. For example, your customers, they may want to know if they will have constant supply. Because if your business fails, they will also be affected. Investors, before they put in their money, they need to know if your business will succeed. So they are also interested in knowing the contents of your business plan. The banks, they need to use it to evaluate the risk, also to use it to evaluate on whether you will be able to pay back whatever they will have lent to you. This is basically depicting the stakeholders in a business plan, but more important is on how banks actually evaluate business plans. Because most people prepare business plans, but not all business plans are funded. Banks reject some of those. So how do banks evaluate business plans? They look at the issue of capital, collateral security, character of the person who wants to borrow, and the conditions. So in terms of capital, before they just put in their capital, you must also put in something. Before they lend you all the loan amount, you must also put in a deposit, so that you sacrifice something. If the business fails, you lose something. Unlike a situation where you are not putting in anything, and if the business fails, you have nothing to lose. So in most cases, when banks want to lend you money, they may request for a deposit. Then collateral security, this is the assurance that the banks can use to say once you fail to pay back, they can attach that particular asset that you have provided as collateral security. So this can be in the form of a property, an immovable asset, or land. Those can be used as collateral security. Then character, your character as a person who wants to borrow, the character of the company or business that wants to borrow. Do you have a history of borrowing? And wherever you borrowed, did you pay back? Or you are that kind of a person or that kind of a business that only remembers when you want to borrow, but when you need to pay back, you forget. So there are certain people who have a bad credit record, a negative or a bad credit history. So whenever you want to borrow, be it for business purposes or for personal use, banks will always find a reason not to lend you money because of your character. However, this also affects those that never borrowed, those without a credit history. Sometimes it becomes difficult for you to access money or to access finances from banks because they also do not know how you will behave when they give you money. You may be sober when you do not have money, but once they lend you a lot of money, they do not know how you will behave. So you are just a risk again. The conditions, like the interest rate at which you will pay back, the period at which you are supposed to pay back, those are seen as the conditions. This is still the matrix for evaluation of business plans. Important for you to go through it and also to read it in your textbook. It's figure 3.2. So in terms of developing a business plan, there are other factors that you need to consider when you want to write a business plan. You should look at the style and ability of the entrepreneur. You should also look at the preferences of management team, complexity of the product or service being offered, competitive environment, and also the level of uncertainty in the business environment. This is when you are considering the scope of the business plan. The scope of the business plan. Then the components of a business plan. Length normally, it's anything between 5 and 20 pages. Appearance of the document is very important. There are no rigid rules regarding the format of the business plan. You ought to identify the key skills or the necessary skills to write it, so that those who read it will actually read it and understand what is in there. They will not just open it to throw it away. You should also determine who should write the business plan. There is a debate on whether it should be written by the entrepreneur himself or herself or by consultants. But the problem of using consultants is that they may have templates that they will just give you. But now when you approach or when you get interviewed by the banks, what you say to the bank and what is in the business plan may actually be different. So it is necessary that a business plan is prepared by the entrepreneur. However, assistance from consultants may be used, but the entrepreneur ought to be there. These are the contents of the business plan. What is supposed to be in a business plan? Basically, the executive summary, which appears first in the document, but normally it is written last. Then we also have the general description of the venture, where you describe the business, ownership, control, and so forth. Then you also have the products and services plan, where you discuss about the product that you are offering or the service that you are offering to the market. Then there's also need to focus on the marketing plan, the management plan, operating plan, financial plan, and obviously to support whatever you have said, you will need to provide some supporting documents. For example, if you say some part of your managers, you have certain qualifications, we must see the qualifications. We must see their CVs. So supporting materials are actually documents to back what you have said in the business plan. This is basically explaining the components of a business plan and what should be included in those plans. So also these notes are basically explaining what should be covered in each of those sections. For example, when you are discussing the general description of the new venture, what are some of the important questions that you ought to address? These are what we are providing in this slide. Then we move on to the location of a business. There are factors, before you choose the location of a business, there are factors that you ought to consider. You can't locate your business where it will be complicated to operate it. So you need to consider a number of factors. So some of the factors that you ought to consider include the source of raw materials. If raw materials are difficult to transport, you need to locate closer to the source of raw materials. But if they are easy to transport, then you may not consider that factor. Availability of labor. If you locate your business where you're thinking, how easy is it for people to actually come and work there? Shouldn't you locate closer to where people are? Then proximity and access to the market. Depending also on the products, it's usually good to locate closer to the market, where you will be able to reach your market, the people that are willing and able to use your products and your services. Then the costs and also the availability of transport facilities, the cost and availability of power, cost and availability of water, availability and costs of site and buildings. These are some of the factors that you ought to consider. Availability of capital, the attitude and regulations, tariffs of local authorities, the existing business environment, the social environment, climate, central government policy, and sometimes also your personal preferences. So in this chapter, we looked at legal forms of business, characteristics, advantages, disadvantages of each of those forms of businesses. We also looked at the business plan, why it is important to draft a business plan, and the main elements of a business plan. Then we also covered the location factors. It may happen that you have questions. We can always engage on Blackboard, discuss these questions, raise your questions, then we discuss them and we answer each other. This will also allow some of your classmates to also answer some of the questions to create that interaction, which is also important. Thank you.